But it all really starts with trying to minimize the rate at which men experience domestic violence and sexual assault. And of course, as a men's issues advocate, that's sort of where I come in. I see this process. I'm like, if we're ever going to see any movement in recognizing and helping men who experience these things, feminism has got to go. Like, it's like the biggest obstacle. Yeah. So that's sort of where I came in. And then all of the other stuff that falls down from that, like the culture wars, the attitudes that women have even to traditional families, traditional women, and everything else fell out of that. But my original main interest, after I was sort of turned on to the subject matter, is actually male victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. So, and advocacy for them. Okay. And when you do that, it becomes almost an inevitable conclusion that feminists have set themselves up as your enemy. Yeah. And there's not much that you will be told. Feminists will say if you oppose feminism, it's your fault, but they set themselves up. No, because
feminists continuously say that they stand for equality, but they do not. Why is it called feminism? Why are we focusing on women? The reason is because at the core of feminism, they are saying that women are oppressed relative to men. And in order to uphold the idea that women are oppressed relative to men, they need all of the evidence that they can get. And part of the evidence is going to be that men are stronger, they beat women, they sexually assault women, and women are on the receiving end of all of this violence and sexual assault. This to them is just evidence of their patriarchy theory, which is the theory that men are oppressors and women are victims. And this is completely wrong. It is just a wrong way of viewing. It is self-centered. It is actually just a self-centered way of viewing the world. It's like, I am woman, I decide that I am a victim and that you are an abuser, men are the abusers, and that it's just completely from the female point of view. We're not asking men, do they also feel like victims? We're not asking men, what are their problems? We're just saying, I know what all the problems in the world are. The problems are what I see, and they obviously are that I am a victim and that he's bad and he is the oppressor. It's a very one-sided way to view gender problems. You know, if you want equality, you're going to have to ask both sides, what are their problems? And then they use race and LGBTQ and other groups to say, well, you know, in the case of race, we have this oppressor and this, the minorities or whatever who are not oppressed and this and that. So it's the same thing with women and men. We don't need to ask them because clearly all of history says that they are oppressors. But they've never, ever looked at all of history. They've never looked at all of history.
Not even a tiny part of it.
No, they've always just pulled the parts of history and the parts of the present that are convenient to build their story. Their story is that men are oppressors. And this story, it's false. It's a false story. And they try to build their story by pulling the parts of history that make it like coverture and laws that were against women and stuff like this. But they don't look at the laws that were against men. They don't look at the laws that were harmful to men. At the very same time that laws were horrible to women, they were horrible. There were other horrible laws to men. But they're not going to pull those laws out and start to talk about that because they're trying to prove their story. Their story is that women are victims and men are oppressors. And they will go through any length, including pulling minorities and LGBTQ and all sorts of people into their drama in order to prove this nonsensical theory that is just a theory and has nothing to do with reality. You know, it's completely
conveniently
crazy.
Everything they look at confirms their ideological approach to reality, which is fundamentally men oppress women.
Right.
And yeah, I could go through all of the stuff, all of the shenanigans they've engaged in when it comes to sexual assault and domestic violence in order to manufacture a narrative that these things are used by men to inflict harm on women and keep them in a state of control so that they can make them do whatever they want.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of problematic scholarship going on in that field in order to maintain that particular framework or conjecture that they have.
But it's really never been that simple, this oppressor versus victim. We both are complicated, and we're both doing nonsense at different points in time, and we're both oppressors and victims or whatever. I don't know. It's really not this clear black and white sort of they are bad and we are good. Of course, that's crazy. Women do a lot of crazy stuff in their own way, and it counts as abuse, So I will start with the first question that I have for you, which is, how did you become, specifically, what is your story? What moment did you decide that you were not a feminist? How did you,
ironically, it was my mother who set me down this path. And in a way that people probably don't expect, because I had recently gone to an all-girls school, and I came back and I was getting more to the radical fringe of feminism. And my mother was originally one of the women who started the Take Back the Night march in our city. And so she was like a feminist from the 1970s. And when I came back from all-girls school and I was moving towards radical feminism, she said, "Okay, I think you need to understand the other side of the situation." She herself had her own journey in feminism. So she was a editor of a feminist journal, and she ended up being mean girled out of that journal, if you know what I mean. All of the other women ganged up on her specifically and ousted her specifically because she wanted to maintain standards of grammar in a published journal so that people could understand what was being written.
Yeah.
And they were radical feminists at the time had all of this stuff about how meritocracy or standards is all patriarchal.
Right.
So anything that constructs a hierarchy is patriarchal. Any kind of standard that you hold things to are patriarchal. So because she's like, well, let's maintain some kind of grammatical standard for the articles that we're publishing, they drummed her out as an agent of the patriarchy.
Yeah.
And so she experienced that. She felt, very alienated. There was some other stuff with radical lesbian separatists. My father would volunteer at these marches, and he'd do things like help out by making drinks, and they would refuse to touch anything that he'd touched because he was a man.
Okay.
And so there's all this kind of stuff that occurred that really made her, soured her on the movement. So she left. And then when I was going through that sort of radical feminist phase, she had material that she had looked at about the other side that she gave me. So she sort of sent me on the path of learning about the situation for men, the issues that men face, and all of that other stuff. And I basically just took off from there. I guess because I had a curious mind, but also for a long time before I went to the all-girls school, I thought the biggest issue for equality was the draft. In other words, if women were to have a say in society, they should also have a corresponding obligation, however you want to, if it's a nursing and doctor draft or like a support draft, some kind of way of sacrificing for the society that they have a say in. And I thought that was like the big feminist issue. Then I got a bit radicalized when I went to the all-girls school. They came back. My mother gave me this materials. It was really fascinating because it's not something I had seen before, so I started looking into it. And even after I had been looking into it, I still identified as a feminist, and I still thought that the most important issue, I went back to the most important issue being the draft. And I remember distinctly there was a moment where I found out that a lot of women in the armed services were getting pregnant to avoid deployment in one of the wars in the Middle East. And I really thought that was a very bad thing to do, because you're destroying the cohesion of your unit. You're reducing the military capability of your country. And it's like and all feminists would do would be to make excuses about these women getting pregnant, and then often they would just have abortions once it was served the purpose, and they would just make excuses. And I'm like, you can't make excuses. Like, this is behavior that is completely unconscionable, because it's not about understanding what you owe, what you owe your troop group, like the group of troops that you are part of, that you've trained with, what you owe your country, and all, and your oaths as a soldier. You're just throwing all of that away. And again, that was the moment I was so disappointed with that. And from that, and that was just the moment. Like, I was disappointed that feminists didn't hold these women who had made oaths to serve and then violated them. They didn't hold them accountable. And then I just started to see, wait, where does feminism hold women accountable?
Nowhere.
Nowhere.
It is a machine for removing all accountability that previously would have even gently touched women. I mean, we've never had a lot of accountability on women, but I think the major thing that, let's say, traditional society held women accountable for would be cheating or something like this. But feminism, no.
They just have no interest in the accountability of women to anything. And so I started to realize that, and that felt to me like a betrayal, because from the beginning, I thought it was about equality, and which equality isn't just equal rights, it's equal responsibilities. So at that point, I'm like, I can't identify as a feminist, because you can't constantly get more and more entitlements to women, and only women, and never look at the obligations, especially the obligations that men have, and call that equality. That's just not equality. It is convenient.
Yeah.
And so I started to talk to and interact with people who were much more on the men's issues, men's rights end of the spectrum. And I realized they had some really good arguments for a lot of the things that they were talking about. And so at one point, I remember that I created this epic thread. I went to, and this is way back in the beginning of the internet, well before smartphones. I went to this feminist forum, and I'm like, okay, I have stuff I'd like you guys to address. And so I brought up these arguments about all of the things that they talked about at the time. So sexual harassment, sexual assault. Sexual assault, I didn't really have very good statistics at the time. It was 25 years ago. But I said, there is still a significant number of men who are dealing with sexual assault by other men. At the time, I didn't realize that male sexual assault by women was actually an issue. And then I also talked about the wage gap and what about the spending gap, and what laws are against women, that, what rights do men have? So I went through all of these.
And what about the one I've been calling a lot now is the sympathy gap, or I think there should be something called empathy gap or sympathy gap. I guess it's gynocentrism, but and that is absolutely statistical truth. Right. We do not care about men. Yeah, but there's men should, the way feminists made a fuss about this wage gap, men need to rally and then start calling it a sympathy gap or empathy gap. What about the empathy gap? They need to make a fuss because it's real and it affects them,
Yeah, well, I mean, they use the empathy gap. Of course, they're not going to admit to it. Right?
Oh, feminists, yeah, that's how feminism thrives, in a sense, because they definitely use the empathy gap to get people to feel sorry for women, and this is part of the success of feminism, because who wants to go against women, who wants to go against women's rights?
Nobody.
Yeah.
Nobody.
You can't get people to call themselves anti-feminists even, because, I mean, it means you're against women. Why would you want to be against women? No, it doesn't mean that. Jeez. But
no.
Yeah.
No, I actually, one of the things that I found out later on in my journey is how much feminism does not mean for women.
No, it doesn't. Feminists are
it's for the ideology.
Of women. It's an ideology. It's like a religion. It's a group of women with very specific thoughts and feelings that definitely don't represent all of women. But in general, women go along with it because we are fed this nonsense that we are a victim, and that, we can use feminism as an excuse for every single failure in our life. So feminism sort of just gives us this, pass to do whatever we want.
Excuses. And a justification for why you're always right.
Okay, we didn't make it financially. Feminism is not our fault. Okay, our relationship is falling apart. Feminism is not my fault. It's all the men's fault. And this is, of course, very convenient for anyone to be able to blame all their problems on someone else. I mean, who wouldn't want that? So feminists sort of feed women something to go along with it in order to use the woman card, to use gynocentrism, to use this sort of empathy gap, And that's why they are so unbeatable. Because they have something that is innate. They have just more empathy than everyone else. We can't conjure that type of empathy, not by saying, that we're anti-feminist, because they have that. This is an innate, natural, instinct that humans have to protect women, to help women, to love women, because women have children inside of them potentially. This goes back to caveman.
Yeah. So just to conclude what I was saying, essentially I brought all of these arguments to this feminist forum, and I got no answers and a lot of abuse. So I realized that feminism had nothing to offer me because it doesn't talk about any kind of responsibilities, which was important to me for whatever weird reason. An idiosyncratic or eccentric reason. I always felt like responsibilities are important. It does not. It demands rights and entitlements without equivalent responsibilities for women. And if you disagree, and if you bring what I thought were incredibly logical arguments, it abuses you. Like that's all they have is agree with us or you'll be abused. And I'm like, I don't want any part of that.
No, they don't allow you to think outside of their box. This is this is the problem with the entire ideology. They just set a bunch of rules, and one of their rules definitely is that men are oppressors and women are not, And if you step outside of any of their rules, then you're wrong, you're bad, you're stupid, you're ignorant, you haven't been to school, you have issues. And this is not intellectual on any level. It's not how. No. This is not how science works. It's not,
Yeah, no. Well, believe me, what they do in terms of feminist scholarship is nothing approaching science.
Yeah. I mean, you should be able to question things.
Yes.
Yeah, but under feminism, you really can't. Because if you say things against their ideology, you get, as you said, hate. And yeah.
Yeah, they don't. Their allegation about reality that men oppress women, they haven't even begun the first stage of making that a scientific observation.
It's just patriarchy theory. What do you think about patriarchy theory? Do you think we live in a patriarchy, or how does that,
No.
It's more complex, right? I guess.
Yeah, it's not as the feminists describe it. And again, they don't even have the allegation that we live in a patriarchy as described by feminists, which, I mean, it's not just a patriarchy. It's not just the observation that men have positions of power, which is generally true around the world. Men tend to occupy positions, I wouldn't say power, but responsibility, overt responsibility. That's true. That's an observation. But they go one step further and they say that means that men have constructed society for their own benefit at the expense of women. And they go even one step further and say that men use things like violence in order to keep women in line. And so in other words, men support a system of violence against the women that they love, which is
absurd.
Sick, actually.
It's sick. Because all the power that men have used has always been directed at protecting the woman in their lives. Society, this structure that they want to call patriarchy, has always tried to protect women. I mean,
and to use an example of that, feminists have framed a history. So the history around sexual assault law in most countries or most historical settings is you start first with a tribe, and if you sexually assault the tribe's women, then that tribe is honor bound to avenge their honor. So you start with this kind of this lynching kind of culture where they kill sexual assaulters from other tribes. And so it's it's the kind of that's one of the ways that they punish sexual assault in the past. And when they sort of started to get more more of a judicial kind of thing going on, they started to have laws or more not just like written laws, but oral laws and meetings and stuff. And gradually they evolved so that sexual assault against women would have financial penalties, which was seen as something that was sort of superior over the previous, because when you have these two tribes with these honor-based systems, then you have like warfare that lasts centuries. You know, one tribe has to hit against the other to offend its honor, and then the other tribe hits against the first to offend, and then it's like the Hatfields and the McCoys. It's like fights that last for generations. And the idea that these tribes would accept a financial penalty in lieu of this continuous warfare was like an advancement in creating a more stable society. And feminists look at all this and they say that women's sexuality was treated like property. Mm-hmm. No, it was originally a source of warfare, mm-hmm. and then it evolved that people were like, okay, we're tired of this constant warfare. Why don't we accept penalties in the form of fines? Mm-hmm. And so they would fine men who engaged in these sexual mm-hmm. violations, which probably also included talking to a woman without her father's consent. Yeah. So and they had decrees.
Judging
but
history.
It was always protected. Like women's sexuality was always protected. It mm-hmm. just changed with the times. And they look back at that and they say, like I said, women's sexuality was treated like property because it was seen as having, well, no, it wasn't even seen as having necessarily a financial worth. It was that at the time, that's how you punished people in order to maintain social stability. Mm-hmm. You punish people with fines because you couldn't, like, there was no prisons, mm-hmm. there were no cops, mm-hmm. you know, there was no judicial. Look back at history, and they see this historical thread of societies choosing to punish men and the tribes those men belong to for their sexual crimes, and they say that is not caring about women. It is absolutely ridiculous.
No, I mean, and this is the thing. Judging history is always more complicated than people mm-hmm. imagine, because we just don't have all of the, elements that played into the mm-hmm. decisions at the time. We cannot imagine what were the stresses of that time. And mm-hmm. so when people judge history, they tend to cherry pick and focus on the parts that, they want. Basically, you get whatever outcome you want, mm-hmm. right? So I really think in all cases, we have to be careful about judging history. It's a terrible thing to do. It shouldn't be done. We really mm-hmm. don't know what people were doing in the past exactly. or why they were doing it, because we just don't know all of the elements that played into their decisions. And I think
but
humans are really hypocrites in that sense.
Yes,
because we always like to judge history and say that we would have done something else, but this is absolutely,
Yeah, well, I mean, what could you do at the time? But, mm-hmm. I mean, even if you look at what we do have in terms of historical records, we can see that the feminist narrative about history is extremely distorted.
Oh, yeah.
And again,
because they use pieces of history. Yeah.
And they don't look at the fact that sexual aggression against men was never considered something. Yeah. Like, it was recognized. Mm-hmm. Ancient people knew that men were sexually assaulted, even mm-hmm. by women. Mm-hmm. They had stories about it, mm-hmm. but they never saw fit mm-hmm. to create systems mm-hmm. to try and punish it.
Right.
And then bring this up, feminists will say, well, they just, men's sexuality is not worth anything. Like it was just, women's sexuality was a commodity to their husbands and fathers and stuff. I'm like, okay, but look at the tribal warfare. Like, is it really being treated like a commodity when you're going off and you're dying to protect your
something is really wrong with feminists. Honor? This type of logic doesn't work on them. I don't know. It's really strange. I don't know. It's maybe they've been so hurt but really something is wrong, because, they will never consider the problems that men face as real.
No. Well, I think it's motivated reasoning. They have no reason to.
Yeah, because a lot of feminism is driven, like on the ground feminist, by people who have been hurt by men, either sexually mm-hmm. assaulted or they had terrible relationships or something else went wrong. And mm-hmm. so it's like they're operating from a position of weird. What is your opinion on intersectionality?
I think there's two things happening with intersectionality. I think in one way, it's a way of a particular core group of feminists to appropriate the issues of people who have legitimate grievances. And then on the other hand, I also think it's a way for more lay or coffee shop feminists to feel like they do have a sense of responsibility to something other than themselves. Because here's the thing, like I recognize that there are these kind of evolutionary pressure to put women and protect women, but I think there is an aspect of women that they do want a sense of responsibility.
Okay.
So intersectionality affords women and who believe in this feminist or this left kind of stuff, it affords them a sense that they have something external to be responsible to.
Right.
And I'm not talking about the hardcore ones that are just manipulating everything.
But
just the women who are just on the ground, they like what they hear. They want to protect a vulnerable group of people, and they want to make sure that society doesn't harm them and whatever else, or provides for them. Like that's not a bad instinct. I think it's more like almost like a maternal instinct, and it probably is better expressed towards children rather than classes of independent adults.
Yeah, but the problem is they're teaching it in universities, right? And the way in which they're teaching
I'm not defending it as an overall concept.
But to me, the thing is, I see what you're saying. This is interesting, actually. But they're teaching this in universities to young, impressionable people, right? To a lot of people. And the thing is, like, the way in which intersectionality is constructed is very wrong, especially towards men. But in general, it's wrong. Because, yes, it is absolutely true that certain groups, like as groups, people feel certain problems. Okay, so certain groups have specific disadvantages and some groups have privilege or whatever. So I can agree with this concept of intersectionality in general. There are groups of people, some of them are some aspects of that is disadvantaged, some aspects may be privileged or whatever, right? But when we look at these groups of people, it's not going to be only race and gender, sexuality and stuff. It's going to, of course, also be like, did you grow up with a mother who was abusive? Did you grow up in a household with drugs?
Did you have a father?
Did you have a father? Did you grow up in poverty? Did you do you have a disability? Do you have, like the list is endless. The list would be hundreds and hundreds of different groups, right? So intersectionality exists, but the groups are, let's say, hundreds of groups, right? But the way in which feminists tackle this thing is that they identify the few groups that we can see. So you can see somebody's race or minority status, maybe by their accent or something. You can see gender. You can see maybe you could see sexuality. Not always, but maybe you could see sexuality, right? So they pick out these groups that we can see, and then they decide to teach people that it is okay to judge people based on these few groups that we can see. Not to get to know somebody and get to know them and figure out whether or not, they face other issues. You know what I mean? This is terrible. So it leads to it's divisive. It leads to and then on top of that, you have the men's issue. That they totally got the whole men's thing wrong. In terms of men are just not privileged compared to women. This is just wrong. It's just wrong. Men being privileged compared to women is only true because feminists don't listen to men. Because feminists don't actually consider men's issues to be issues because they're self-centered. So if you don't listen to what the other person is saying, then sure, you will think they're privileged.
There's only one side.
Yeah, there's only one side. It doesn't have anything to do with truth. It's just your opinion. So they have the opinion that men are privileged. Then, okay, in terms of race, I see that in terms of if you are a minority in a setting where you're a minority, you're going to have some issues, right? But I wouldn't say that I agree that minorities will have issues. I'm not saying that they don't. They would have issues compared to, but I don't think that this issue is like, if you're going to do intersectionality, well, address the issues that are most important. I don't think that this issue is one of the most important issues that faces a person. You know, like I just don't think that. I think if you're gonna rate things, there's so many things that will come higher up in the
than the categories that they've constructed.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I gotcha.
And I think, and it sometimes I think that the categories that they constructed, why are they like that? Is it like something to do with voting or something like, or not voting specifically, but like, are they trying to get numbers? Like, okay, because women, that's a big group. Minorities in America, at least, this is a big group. You have Latinos, you have Black people, you have like a big group. Then, of course, LGBTQ, big group. You know, it's like, I guess it's like 8% of the population. So, yeah, they go for these big groups so that they have a lot of people who would be inclined to support them because they're telling these people they are victims. And who would, again, who doesn't want to hear that? Of course you want to hear you're a victim. It gives you an excuse. But the problem is, y'all are creating a weird stratification in society based on nonsense. Yes. It's like, that's not how this works. Yes, some privilege exists and disadvantage exists, but you can't tell me how I am privileged and disadvantaged before you know me. But feminists will come and look at me and say, oh, you you know, like, so they're encouraging, in a sense, racism. They're encouraging this sort of like stereotyping, discrimination, because you can only see these groups, but you can't see whether or not somebody's mother was a alcoholic, drug addict, neglecting, narcissist, or whatever. You can't see if somebody grew up in an abusive home. These are groups too, right?
Yeah, and there's actually a huge group that is often disenfranchised throughout all of human history that is completely unrecognized. And it's like they talk about how trans people have a part of their brain that makes them not fit in. Well, there is actually a group of people that don't naturally adhere to the dominant social narrative. So they question the things that are told. Like there is sort of an instinct that people have to kind of adhere to what they consider to be the mores of society, like the dominant social narrative. Right. But often that narrative requires a lot of like ambiguous, like sometimes it's about a God that you can't prove.
Right,
I mean,
religion.
I'm not saying that God doesn't exist, religion,
no, but yeah,
or other kind of beliefs. And there's always like a group of people in society, like they're almost like seeker ants. They just don't go along the trail with the other ants. They got to go off the trail.
We had religion in the past, and now the religion of today is feminism. Feminists have replaced religion with their doctrine.
Yeah, there's always people who have questioned the central doctrines of society, and it's not just because just arbitrary.
Right.
That it's because they have a particular part of their brain. Like there's parts of your brain that activate in certain people when they conform to social norms, and these people they just are different. They don't. It doesn't activate as much, or it isn't as strong. It's not as strong an impulse. So they tend to veer off and go on different directions from the normal, like a seeker ant going off on the adventure. And people like that, even though they could be black, they could be white, they could be gay, straight, they could be men or women.
Right.
It doesn't, like, the external appearance is it's never different. Like, they look exactly like everybody else, but on a fundamental level, inside their brains, the way they process information is different, and they have to go off, and they go off on their own little tangents, and they get killed constantly throughout history. Like, there's a huge amount of people who think differently who end up dead. And this is not just an arbitrary decision on their part. They are genetically and phenotypically different.
Yeah. Okay, well,
they are separate, and yet nobody cares.
Okay, well, I don't know about them. I probably can't help them. That's probably nature that's killing them off. I don't know.
But what I'm saying is that there is that element. Like there are groups that they just don't advocate for at all.
Of course, because within society today, of course, within.
But that's one aspect that you're talking about, how you have to understand the individual to understand their privilege, or to understand where they have privilege and right, and you can't just look at them to see that.
And the problem